Well, everyone, it's official. The situation in Gaza has now reached a tipping point, and Netanyahu's final plan for Gaza is so scary that it could change the entire future of the Middle East in a catastrophic way. Israel is now preparing for its final push into Gaza and will not stop until it achieves a full occupation of the entire region. Now, to prepare for this move, Israel has caused the humanitarian crisis to reach catastrophic levels. Food and water are critically scarce under a full blockade, and deaths from starvation and malnutrition are rising sharply, especially among children, the elderly, and the sick. But as the world is standing witness to the atrocities being carried out in Gaza, something monumental is happening on the world stage. Countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and France are now preparing to officially recognize Palestine at next month's UN summit. For nearly 2 years, Western governments and mainstream media have struggled or outright refused to call this war exactly what it is. But the images of Gaza today have become impossible to ignore, and it's time to call a spade a spade. This has nothing to do with Israel's self-defense, and everything to do with a complete annihilation of a region and its people. The power to end this unjust war lies squarely with Netanyahu, but as pressure mounts, he still hasn't moved an inch. Will the international community rise to stop the world's largest humanitarian crisis, or will Netanyahu push forward with his final terrifying act? Let's break it down in today's important video. Everyone, Netanyahu's green light for Israel's annexation campaign is not a sudden development, but has been decades in the making. Today, the remaining Palestinian territories are confined to the West Bank of the Jordan River and the Gaza Strip. Over the years, Israeli settlers have steadily encroached on the West Bank, establishing large, state-supported settlements on Palestinian land. These settlements are justified by claims that the land was divinely promised to the Jewish people. In practice, they're built by forcibly displacing Palestinians who have lived there for generations under the protection of heavily armed IDF soldiers. This systematic land confiscation and the expansion of illegal settlements have been overwhelmingly condemned at the United Nations. In fact, the vast majority of the world's nations have consistently voted for Israel to remove its illegal settlements in the West Bank. Yet, as outlined by this article from The Atlantic, Israel's far-right settler movement is now setting its sights on something even more extreme: the annexation of Gaza itself. While the West Bank has been slowly carved away by settlements, Gaza has remained relatively untouched, though not unoppressed. The Gaza Strip is frequently described as the world's largest open-air prison, as Gaza has been under blockade and residents unable to leave for the past 20 years. In 2005, Israel withdrew 8,000 settlers from Gaza, handing nominal control to the Palestinians, a move that many Israeli settlers never forgave. Today, amid the chaos of war, Israel's far-right settler movement has found a new opening to push its agenda. Fueled by the current conflict, right-wing leaders have begun organizing a political movement aimed at re-annexing Gaza and repopulating it with Jewish settlements. Since the war began, over a third of the lawmakers in Netanyahu's government have publicly backed the plan. Among the most vocal is far-right minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who recently declared, "We are relaying a message that from today on, we are conquering the entire Gaza Strip, announcing our sovereignty on the entire Gaza Strip, taking down every Hamas member, and encouraging voluntary emigration." His term voluntary emigration is anything but that. Once again, let's call it exactly what it is. Israel's far-right government wants to get rid of every Palestinian in the region and control the entire piece of land for the future. And now, according to recent reporting, this plan has officially been approved by Netanyahu and his far-right cabinet, despite significant pushback from within Israel's own security establishment. In fact, more than 600 former Israeli security officials urged President Trump to bring an end to Israel's war in Gaza in an open letter, citing that the IDF has long accomplished the two goals of dismantling Hamas military formations and governance. The reality is that public opinion holds little sway over Benjamin Netanyahu. He has far too much at stake to consider ending the war in Gaza. And as long as he remains in power, the offensive is unlikely to stop. In fact, there are 3 core reasons why Netanyahu is committed to continuing this conflict, the most immediate reason being his need to stay in power at all costs. In Israel's most recent election, his coalition secured just 48.4% of the vote, relying heavily on the backing of a far-right anti-Arab parties to form a government. These parties demand that he continue the offensive at all costs. Without their support, his fragile coalition would collapse, and so would his grip on power. But his incentive to continue the war doesn't stop at staying in power. Bibi is also facing corruption charges that predate October 7th. In fact, Netanyahu is currently on trial for corruption, facing charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. He is accused of accepting luxury gifts, including cigars, champagne, and jewelry worth over $200,000 from wealthy businessmen in exchange for political favors. In another case, he allegedly negotiated favorable media coverage with a newspaper publisher in return for efforts to weaken a competing outlet. The most serious charge involves claims that Netanyahu granted regulatory benefits worth over $300 million to a telecom company in exchange for positive coverage on its news site. Facing this plethora of corruption charges, Netanyahu's critics argue he is among the most corrupt leaders in any democracy today. But remarkably, Netanyahu has done everything to avoid persecution. This has included pushing back court dates by any means necessary, citing military developments, launching airstrikes on court dates, and even citing food poisoning to delay testimony. Getting tired of putting up with any sort of charade of going along with the legal process, Netanyahu has recently moved to fire the Attorney General prosecuting him for corruption. In reality, without the excuse of war, Bibi would have to finally face the charges levied against him. Last, and perhaps the largest incentive of all, Netanyahu needs to continue the war to push off persecution for war crimes committed in Gaza. The International Court of Justice has already issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. Their warrants are for crimes including starvation as a method of warfare, intentionally directing attacks against civilians, murder, persecution, and other inhumane acts. These arrest warrants were issued in November 2024. Even if the evidence of targeting civilians wasn't already clear by then, irrefutable proof has since emerged, showing the deliberate starvation and attacks on Gaza's civilian population. Israel has now carried out a near total siege on food and humanitarian aid entering the Gaza Strip, which has led to widespread starvation among the population. Israel has blocked all sources of international aid from entering and instead have replaced established channels with a new organization of their own called the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in cooperation with the US government. These distribution sites are not staffed by humanitarian professionals. Instead, they are staffed by the IDF and US mercenaries. According to Doctors Without Borders, these sites have been described as orchestrated killing zones. The aid sites are intentionally placed in active combat zones, many miles away from where civilians are sheltering. Starving civilians, forced to traverse dangerous war zones to reach these locations, are often met not with food and care, but with flash grenades, pepper spray, and live fire used to herd them. Numerous videos have now emerged of soldiers deliberately firing into crowds seeking aid. And if you want more proof of the atrocities that are happening right now, listen to the words of U.S. military Green Beret veteran and whistleblower Anthony Aguilar, who described his time working with the U.S. and Israeli-backed Gaza Humanitarian Foundation.
What I witnessed in Gaza, I can only describe as a dystopian, post-apocalyptic wasteland. We, the United States, are complicit, we are involved, hand in hand, in the atrocities and the genocide that is currently undergoing in Gaza. We aren't there on the distribution sites defending ourselves against Hamas. We are using indiscriminate force, targeting civilians, escalation of force that goes far beyond the measures of appropriate against an unarmed, starving population.
This testimony is unbelievable, and right now there are countless videos showing American mercenaries participating in these aid sites, including throwing stun grenades and indiscriminate shooting of live munitions over crowds. In fact, a recent video has gone viral, showing U.S. soldiers evidently enjoying the abuse at these so-called aid sites.
I think you hit one.
You have to be sick in the head to get enjoyment from watching people suffer, starve, and shot to death. But this is where the situation is right now. For nearly 2 years, all we've heard from Israeli authorities is we have the right to defend ourselves. But take a look at these images. Is this Israel defending itself, or is this the complete destruction of an entire region? According to the United Nations, approximately 92% of all homes in Gaza have been either destroyed or damaged. Gaza, already one of the most densely populated places in the world, has seen its entire population pushed into tents within a restricted zone which continues to be targeted by bombardments. Honestly, we have to ask ourselves as the international community, how can anyone justify these actions as defensive? Israel has used October 7th as a cause to carry out what Israeli leaders have always wanted for Gaza: complete destruction and the elimination of any future or hope for the people and the region. This is exactly what the Israeli government does not want the world to see. It's also why Prime Minister Netanyahu cannot afford to end the war, because doing so would open Gaza to international scrutiny, and the full extent of the crimes committed would finally be exposed. Shamefully, these images are absent from mainstream media. Yet across social media and independent reporting, like this YouTube channel, the truth is becoming increasingly difficult to suppress. The global community is standing firmly with Palestine, and even in the United States, fewer than 1/3 of citizens support Israel's actions in Gaza, a dramatic decline compared to polling before the war. Among younger Americans, support for Israel is virtually non-existent. While some European countries are beginning to yield to public pressure, the US government, the single most powerful actor capable of ending the war, refuses to budge. In direct opposition to the will of the American people, US politicians continue to show unwavering allegiance to the foreign government of Israel. And to show you just how extreme US politicians' allegiance to Israel is, I want you to take a look at these tweets on a recent public campaign. Whenever Israel needs diplomatic cover, US politicians flood to social media with carbon copy declarations of unwavering support for whatever crime Israel dictates. The most recent being US politician tweets to literally threaten Ireland for making their own decision to boycott Israel. Just look at these tweets using the same hollow phrases and rehearsed outrage, clearly reading from a shared script. No deviation, no dissent, just the unmistakable fingerprints of Tel Aviv and AIPAC's influence, dictating every word. With the vast majority of US politicians being paid by the Israeli lobby, dissenting voices are incredibly rare. Notably controversial Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene has been very outspoken against AIPAC's influence on her colleagues. Marjorie has been isolated in Congress for saying something as simple as that she wants to represent the United States, the country that she was elected to serve, as well as correctly identifying AIPAC lobbies for a foreign country, and in fact should register as a foreign agent. Simple facts that would be completely apparent if you switched out Israel with literally any other country. One of the most egregious examples of the US government's commitment to Israel is a decision from the Trump administration to withhold disaster relief funds by banning taxpayer-funded assistance to any organization that refuses to engage with Israeli companies. Ironically, FEMA mandates that recipients of these grants certify that they do not and will not, during the term of this financial assistance, award, operate any programs that advance or promote DEI or discriminatory equity ideology. Yet this very policy enforces the most extreme form of preferential treatment, not for marginalized American communities, but for a foreign country. What's happening in Gaza is not a chaotic byproduct of war. It is a deliberate, systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing, approved at the highest levels of Israeli leadership. Netanyahu's manufactured collapse of humanitarian aid are all calculated steps towards permanent annexation. This strategy has been enabled by far-right settlers, backed by state power and shielded by a political structure that allows Netanyahu to evade justice, not only for corruption at home, but for war crimes on the world stage. Despite international law, growing global outrage, and even internal dissent from Israeli security officials, the war continues to grind on, simply because one man in Netanyahu has every personal and political reason to keep it that way. Meanwhile, the US government, despite overwhelming public opposition to Israel's actions, continues to provide cover. American mercenaries are on the ground, and media blackouts point to a disturbing truth. The war persists, not in spite of the West, but because of it. Now with 92% of Gaza's homes destroyed, civilians forced into tent encampments, and so-called aid sites turned into zones of violence, the world is watching the worst war atrocities unfold in real time. Whether it ends will depend on if the West, and especially the United States, are willing to break with complicity. Until then, the war will continue, not because it must, but because no one in power is willing to stop it. Everyone, I want to thank you for making it to this point of the video. Today's topic was difficult to discuss because the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is one of the worst human atrocities I have ever witnessed in my life. I want to thank my team for doing the incredible research and for putting this video together, and I hope that it brings more people around the world to see the reality of what is happening in Gaza. I have always been a proponent of a two-state solution, and I'm encouraged that more countries around the world are starting to officially recognize Palestine, because this method, not an annexation, is the only way forward for long-term peace and stability in the entire Middle East. As always, I want to thank you all for your incredible support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.